It's really wonderful to be with everyone at FutureChurch and to talk about the Pope's trip to Canada, because while the trip was, of course, acknowledging the grievous and historical wrongs of the Catholic Church in Canada, it also was, in a sense, sort of asking the question, what sort of future will the church look like there, and will it be a church that recognizes the contributions of the many Indigenous in the land. So to the Canadians on the call especially, thank you for the wonderful hospitality that we all enjoyed for a very exhausting but journalistically satisfying 5 nights, 6 days in Canada last month. And what I was telling Russ and Deb that I wanted to do today at the beginning is really just show a few images of the Pope's trip. I've selected 5 or 6 images of the trip because I'm a print journalist, and I think what print journalists do is incredibly important, of course. But what these photos convey are so many of the gestures and important moments of the trip. And as we all know, Pope Francis, for the last decade now, often speaks more memorably in gestures rather than he does in words. And some of these photos you may have seen, some of them may have been missed, but I thought I'd sort of use 5 or 6 of these images as touchstones to talk about the trip, not to take you through it day by day necessarily, but to kind of capture a few highlights and give you maybe the inside story or just some observations as someone who was on the ground each day. But I don't want to be the one doing all the talking. I think this is best as a conversation. And so I'll just kind of get started here, and then we can make this a much more inclusive chat. So it's not just me monologuing the entire time. But this first image that I've chosen here, and I should say all these photos are from the Catholic News Service. The wonderful photographer there, Paul Herring, my colleague here in Rome with Catholic News Service, he's captured these images, and they're just wonderful memories of the trip. And this first one here is of the Pope soon after he touched down on July 24th in Edmonton, Canada. And unlike past papal visits, you know, when the Pope arrives in a country, it is a very formal and often very celebratory exercise. There's loud music playing, and often you see dancing, and it has a bit of a carnival-like atmosphere. And that was not at all the scene that greeted Pope Francis when he arrived in Edmonton. He walked, he was taken off the plane by a lift. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, the Pope has struggled with his mobility over the last 5 months due to a fracture in his knee. And so he's now having to use a lift to board and exit planes. But rather than meeting first with Prime Minister Trudeau or the Governor General, Mary Simon, the first people that the Pope interacted with were Indigenous elders and survivors. The image I'm showing you now is the Pope greeting the initial delegation there, and this is of a residential school survivor. And while there was some music, there were some Indigenous drummers present there at the airport, the very first words of Pope Francis did not come until the following day. They had a very solemn ceremony at the airport. It was near silence. And it was a really remarkable thing as a reporter to keep silent during an event like this, because we're all so used to there being noise and everyone chattering and trying to jockey for better positions. But it was almost eerie how quiet it was there at the airport. And again, the Indigenous performers, drummers performed. The Pope shook hands and had a few brief exchanges. He kissed the hand of a residential school survivor. And then the first we heard of him was the next day. So I'm going to advance to the next image here to talk about that first full day in the country. And let's hope technology cooperates with us here. So let's see here. Oh, sorry. There we go. So this is an image, and I would say it's among or a variation of this image has been the most iconic of the Pope's time in Canada. And this image came at the end of the Pope's first event in Canada. This was just outside of Edmonton in Alberta. And the Pope began his day by going and visiting a cemetery at the site of a former residential school building. And then after he went to the cemetery and prayed there in silence, he then first heard from survivors firsthand, and then he offered his own remarks. And in many respects, this was the moment everyone had been waiting for in the lead up to the trip, because, you know, as a part of the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, the Pope was not only asked to apologize for the church's involvement in running residential schools, but to do so on the ground in Canada. So the Pope first issued that apology on April 1st after he had held a series of meetings with Indigenous delegations here at the Vatican. But this was the big moment for him to deliver in Canada. And he did so in a speech that we were all paying close attention to, because the big question was, what were we going to hear from Pope Francis? What we heard here at the Vatican in April was the Pope saying, "I'm sorry," but effectively saying, you know, there were some bad actors, there were some priests and some religious officials that did terrible things. And what so many of the Indigenous representatives that I spoke to expressed in the time period between April of this year and July was that they wanted to hear the Pope take ownership that institutionally the church had adopted, you know, systematically policies that contributed to this abuse. And so it was in this speech the Pope issued that first apology on Canadian soil. And he did step up his apology, sort of apologizing for the cultural destruction that he said Catholic policies had contributed to and were the result of. So this was the big day of the first apology. And this image that you're seeing here is at the end of that. And it was with the Pope, he's coming face to face with one of the chiefs, and the chief put the headdress on Pope Francis. And there's been a lot of discussion about this moment and this image in particular. And you know, some have asked, you know, was this, you know, some form of cultural appropriation, seeing the Pope wear the headdress? And that's something that, you know, as a reporter, I don't feel I'm equipped to weigh in on. I think the Indigenous that were present have their own interpretation of that image, and that is their, you know, their judgment call to make. I would say most of the backlash that I heard in Canada was not that he wore the headdress. It was some survivors had said that by seeing the Pope being given that headdress and wearing it, some survivors said that they felt that their representatives, their leaders, had chosen to side with the Pope rather than those that had experienced abuse. So but there were also others that said it was a very powerful act and sign of solidarity. And so, like many things with this trip, where, you know, every move and word of the Pope was being carefully monitored and watched and parsed, it's in a sense left up for interpretation, and we can chat about that a bit more. But I think, you know, this image is one of the most iconic of the trip, and so I think it's a necessary touchstone to use to talk about the Pope's trip to Canada. The next image was, this was also in Alberta in the initial days of the trip. It's a very beautiful image in my opinion. This was at Loch St. Anne. And Loch St. Anne is the busiest pilgrimage site of Indigenous peoples in all of North America. And the sort of big gathering point is on the Feast of St. Anne. And this is when the Pope chose to be there. The entire trip had been organized around the Feast of St. Anne, because the Indigenous in particular have a real devotion to St. Anne, who of course is the patron saint of, among other things, the elderly and grandparents. And at the beginning of his time at Loch St. Anne, the Pope was wheeled, you know, for quite some distance. It took him about 15 minutes to get there, to the shores of Lake St. Anne here, where he prayed silently for a few moments. And the waters of Lake St. Anne have historically been attributed to having healing powers. It's become a pilgrimage site for people that are physically or in some other form suffering, that they have come to Lake St. Anne. And so the Pope, of course, would have come here anyway, I think, because it was such an important place and a marker for so many of Canada's Indigenous. But I think it was a particularly poignant moment to see Pope Francis, now in a wheelchair, himself having his own mobility issues and admittedly suffering a great deal of pain, there, in a sense, in a very physical way, exposing and showing and not hiding his own vulnerabilities, and in a sense, his own need and desire for healing, or at least relief from pain there. And so I think this image captured it quite well. And of course, after this image, the Pope went back and there was a big ceremony. And this, I would say, marked a turning point in the trip. The Pope then apologized again at this venue. But the tone began to shift at this point in the trip, because you did hear more of the more customary music and song and dance here at the lake, because this is a pilgrimage site, and that's typically what happens there. And the Pope was, both there to offer an apology, but also as a guest of honor. It's a really special day, quite humid day, I have to say, but a very special day in the trip. So. This next image here is a bit perhaps difficult to see what's going on here. You can see there's some bishops present in the foreground. But what is happening here is this is the Pope's Mass in Quebec. So after he began his trip with 2 nights in Edmonton, he moved to the French-speaking area of Canada in Quebec City. And on his first full day there, he held a Mass at the National Shrine. And all the bishops of Canada were present there. A number of Indigenous representatives, survivors were there. The Governor General of Canada was present, along with Prime Minister Trudeau. And right as the Mass was beginning, 2 Indigenous representatives unfurled this banner that you can see here that says, "Rescind the doctrine." It doesn't say it on there, but the doctrine that they are talking about is the doctrine of discovery. And I suspect we'll have lots of questions and comments about that in a few moments here. But the doctrine of discovery is, in a sense, an umbrella term that has been used to describe both the theological concept and also juridical precedent, where, among others, past popes dating back to the 14th century have used, have said that, use theological justifications for the church colonizing certain parts of the world, including Canada. And that theological concept, and also juridical one, has been cited in case law in Latin America, Canada, and the United States. And this, in a sense, has been a constant refrain from the time the delegates arrived here at the Vatican in March of this year, is that they want to see the Vatican formally rescind the doctrine of discovery. If you talk to Vatican officials, they will say it's a concept without any authority, without any weight, without any legal merit. But there has been no formal rescission of it. And this has been a real demand we heard over and over again throughout the trip. And at the end of the trip, when the Pope, minutes after we took off en route back to Rome, the Canadian bishops released a statement sort of summarizing what they heard throughout the week. And this was one of their key points, is that they will continue to try to work with the Vatican for the language they used was a statement of clarification on the doctrine of discovery. So we'll chat about that, I'm sure, in the exchange in just a few minutes. But stay tuned, because I think this is something that we'll be keeping our eyes on at the National Catholic Reporter. So much more to come. This is an image here of a drummer on the very final day and the final stop of the Pope's trip at Iqaluit. Iqaluit is technically in the Arctic. It's about a little over 3-hour flight from Quebec City. It is the second most remote location a Pope has ever visited, and it is the most remote location Pope Francis has ever visited. It's a small, town, city of about 7,000 people. And this was the final stop on the Pope's trip. And the reason why I wanted to show this image was because the scene that welcomed Pope Francis in Iqaluit had the Indigenous drummers, which you see here. At the very end, the drummer presented the drum to Pope Francis and gave it to him. But it also began with song, including the famous Indigenous throat singers. And it was an event marked, I would say, with tons of symbolism, where you really saw Indigenous cultures and customs on display in a way that you hadn't seen them in such a fully throated way throughout the trip thus far. And for me, there was a real sort of, I would say, sadness in a sense that you only saw it in this full display right there at the very end. A constant refrain that we heard throughout the trip was that in the Pope's two masses, both in Edmonton and in Quebec, that there were complaints that Indigenous aspects of worship were not fully incorporated into the liturgies in the trip. And so I think this image captures, you see the Pope there, he's smiling. He was very much attentive to this. And to the surprise of many of us, we didn't see that as much in the liturgies. The vestments, of course, were a way of sort of paying tribute to Indigenous cultures that the Pope and other bishops wore during the actual masses. But we didn't see this, song and dance and music in the same way. And some saw that as a missed opportunity. And the final image that I want to show here is of the Pope's press conference with the journalists en route back to Rome. And I show this image for a few reasons. One, because Pope Francis's press conferences have become, let's say, a bit infamous. It's where he faces, a grilling from my colleagues. We get to ask the Pope any sort of questions we want. The questions start out with conversation about the trip itself, and then we can ask about a range of topics. The Pope spoke with us for about 45 minutes on the flight back. You can see that he's seated. This is the first time in 36 trips abroad that the Pope had to sit during the press conference. And again, this is a result of his knee pain. But despite the fact that he was seated and in pain, he was in good spirits and in really good form. And I think the Pope, frankly, thought the trip was a big success. I think he knew going into the trip that it was going to be a difficult trip. It was not going to have the same tenor or tone as other papal trips, that this was going to be one that he was going simply to say, I'm sorry, and beg for forgiveness. But I think he came out of this trip feeling as if the encounters that he had were meaningful encounters, and that it had been worth the effort. Just before this trip, at the beginning of July, the Pope canceled a highly anticipated visit to Congo and South Sudan that he'd been wanting to make since 2017. So there was a lot of speculation as to whether Pope Francis could pull off such a trip. He had not spent this much time in one country since 2016 when he went to Mexico. So it was a big undertaking for him to do, both with knee issues and at age 85 to do this. But we see him here at the end of the trip, smiling, laughing, joking with reporters. In terms of the trip itself, I'd say the most newsworthy thing that the Pope said in this press conference was he was asked about the word genocide. And in the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report, the Catholic Church's involvement in the residential schools is described as a cultural genocide. And the Pope was asked whether or not he agreed with that assessment, because he never used that word or that phrase during the trip. And the Pope said, it wasn't a phrase that was on my mind. But then he started ticking off what had happened at the residential schools. And he said, yes, we can use this word. We can say it is a cultural genocide. And for that, again, I asked my forgiveness. So that was, in a sense, particularly satisfying news for many Canadian advocates who felt that was language that they wanted to hear throughout the trip. And I think they felt some relief that the Pope finally used that language, even if it was on the flight back to Rome. So these images were not meant to provide a fully comprehensive look at the Pope's trip to Canada. There were many more moments in between. But I thought they could, in a sense, provide us a way to revisit that week in a more memorable, personal way. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Russ and Deb to kick us off our conversation, because again, I hope it is just that, a conversation. Any and all questions are on the table, and I'll do my very best to answer your questions.
Great. Thank you, Chris. That was spectacular. So we're going to open it up. And so if you have a question, you can use your little reaction button at the bottom and raise your hand, or you can hold it up and I will see you. So please go ahead and offer your questions. Chris, one of the things we heard, and Tom Rees wrote about this, like he hadn't, he didn't understand the doctrine of discovery, and that's because the people around him hadn't briefed him properly. What's your reaction to that conversation?
That's a very fair and good question, Deb. And I predicted I would get this question. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that as much as I value Tom Rees's perspective and wisdom and insights, and think he's a very trusted Vatican analyst, I think I would disagree on this. I mean, there are two reasons for this. The primary one being that prior to this trip, the Pope had just spent an entire week with delegates here in Rome at the end of March into the beginning of April, where the doctrine of discovery repeatedly was discussed and came up. So I do believe that from those individual conversations going back to March, there were conversations about the doctrine of discovery where the Pope was in the room, present and actively participating in this. And the Vatican, which has many, flaws and problems, I think if you talk to any diplomat from around the world, I was just with one this morning, regardless of whatever issues they have with the Vatican ideologically, they will all say the Vatican runs a first-class diplomatic corps, and that they're always very well polished. So I do think the Pope was probably decently advised on this trip heading into it, and had already had some of these conversations previously with Indigenous delegates back in March. The other thing I would just say about this, and this is maybe my perspective from being on the plane, was that was the second question that was asked to the Pope about the doctrine of discovery. And it was asked by one of the Canadian journalists on board the plane from the CBC. And this is not at all a slight to the colleague at all. I would just say the question, the way it was asked, was a bit muddled. And it was asked to the Pope in English, and then it was translated to him. And the Pope seemed to be having a real issue sort of trying to understand what she was getting at. And the way one veteran journalist on the trip put it was that the journalist was drowning in the deep end and the Pope didn't help her out. So it wasn't as much about what he knew or didn't know. It was about a very poor phrasing of the question, and the Pope simply, I don't know if you want to chalk it up to him being tired, grumpy, or just not quite making sense of what she was trying to get at there. I think it's very, the Pope understands the doctrine of discovery, from his own Latin American context pretty well. You can go back to 2007 or 8 where he gave a really important talk about, the church's failures with Indigenous people. And he gave this talk at Petersita. And so I think this is a history that he's painfully aware of. So.
Great. Do you think there'll be a time when he might take it on as something that the church would formally do?
So I think the understanding is that there will be a statement in the coming perhaps weeks, I'd say, given the way things operate here, probably months is a fairer guess. I don't know that you will hear or see the word recension. I think you may see something such as the language of it being null or with or something like that. The way one Vatican official put it was, popes have made plenty of errors in the past, and we don't go back cherry picking them and using the language of recension. We just established that that is no longer precedent. And so I think you'll see some sort of language to that effect. Now, I'm not a judge as to whether or not I think that's going to satisfy people or should satisfy people. I'm just telling you what I think you're going to get. So.
Okay, so we have a question from Chaplain Donna. I'm going to go ahead and maybe turn on your camera too.
I'm not going to turn on the hair way but up, but that's okay. So I'm going to disagree with you 110%. I think Tom Rees was spot on. First of all, it started off on the wrong foot in Rome. I've spoken with First Nations people hand to hand on the phone. I've spoken with survivors who have been pulled out of Canada and put in schools in the United States of America and didn't find out until they were in their 30s that they were not thought they were. I think that the doctrine of discovery needs to be spoken to specifically. I think that as much as I dearly love Francis with all my heart, that he was totally misled. I'm going to start off by saying that I think that this whole thing was nothing more than religious gloss. Unfortunately, I think he was totally misled, just like Archbishop Bogano misled him in the United States of America when he never let him understand or helped him to understand that he did the exact same thing here. He canonized Fra Serra without ever talking to the dozens of California tribes who wanted to speak to him about the doctrine of discovery first. They were never heard, and they're still pissed. The feeling on the ground in Canada is they're not happy in the first place, and all he did was exacerbate it. I truly believe that in his heart of hearts, he thought he was doing the right thing. But when you talk of mother church, do mothers kidnap children, abuse them, rape them? I don't think so. When you say you're coming close and near to the people, does that mean sitting on a date nowhere near them? When you say that you've heard chiefs, do you understand that the chiefs that he was presented with were elected by 690 other chiefs, that they don't even directly represent the tribes they said they did? Do you think that when you went to see the graves, it's appropriate to take with you more blood robes representing the people who did that abuse and the media instead of a survivor whom we could have sat next to and held the hand of? How pastoral is that? I truly believe he meant well, but I think he missed by a mile. It wasn't even translated, his speech in the arena wasn't even translated by a First Nations person in a First Nation language. Never acknowledged that he was on their holy ground. He never even named Canada Turtle Island. He was totally, as I said, not informed at all, and it was a massive mess, in my opinion, and the First Nations people that I've spoken with. And I'll step back for just a minute and say, as a board certified chaplain, he totally blew it.
Okay.
I don't have much to respond. I want to say that I think that's a fair perspective. And as I said earlier, you can talk to 1,000 people about this trip, and you're going to get 1,000 perspectives, different perspectives. Some saying completely blew it, as you did. Others saying, it was a start in the right direction. And so I think it's one of those trips that is very much up for interpretation. My personal opinion is the Pope knew that he had to go do this trip But I think there is an understanding that he recognizes that it was just a start and perhaps a small step. So.
Okay, other questions? I saw another hand, but that person was up and gone. Do we have other questions?
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
My name is Scotty Arthur McCaffrey. I have a question for Christopher as a reporter. I've been bothered by all of the newspaper reports about the Pope's trip, which have been a bit simplistic and stereotypical in painting the issue as black and white. In other words, Indigenous people all good, white Canadians all bad, and they came in as conquerors and abused and captured these people and did what they wanted. Has anybody done any digging about the origins of the school system and why it was required in the first place to begin with? Did Indigenous people have a different conception of education? They didn't create schools. They didn't care for their children's education and advancement the same way the rest of Canada did. So instead of having a simplistic black and white, were there problems in the way that the Indigenous people reared and educated their children? But unfortunately, the solution that white Canada brought to address that problem turned out to be ill-conceived, ill-administered, and have bad effects. So I'd like to ask you if you could look a wee bit at the history and from a reporter's point of view, move away from the simplistic, stereotypical view of all good, all bad, and throw some light on the origins of the problem. Thank you very much.
Well, in terms of the origins, I'll just say a few things. One, I think the best sort of starting point is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, because it's a thick volume with I forget the number, but thousands of firsthand testimonials and accounts. And what the Truth and Reconciliation report, I think, does is try to establish, the facts, the truth. And, one of the things that I think is repeatedly expressed and was expressed during the trip was that intentions and motivations varied. And, I spoke to a number of, survivors there in Canada who talked about they themselves had positive experience in the residential schools, but they were very well aware of the fact that their experience was not at all comprehensive and was, very much probably the minority experience. So in terms of the origins, I think it is important to establish the fact, and Prime Minister Trudeau said this on the third or fourth day during the trip, that this was a government started scheme that Catholic institutions took on, and Catholic institutions operated about 60% of the residential schools. A number of other Protestant churches operated quite a number of these schools as well. But this was a government instituted scheme rather than a church instituted scheme. But it was for the, at least a majority of them operated by Catholic officials. And so you heard the Pope say at various times throughout the trip, this was a government scheme that the church willfully went along with. And while in some cases did good, way too many Catholics became, participatory in the abuse that was perpetuated for a century at these schools. So I think, you did see this sort of acknowledgement that while some of the founding and the origins of these schools may have had some noble intentions, what ended up happening through these policies for a century, decimated Indigenous cultures. So I do think you did see that there was some gray, even in Prime Minister Trudeau's Governor General Simon's and Pope Francis's words.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Lillian, you have a question.
I don't have a question. I have a comment. As a Canadian, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, excuse me, he was the one who decided to have schools for the Indian children, but it was also to take the Indian out of the child. They wanted to make these children Canadian. And they had the Royal Mounted Police would go to a home, take a child, a young, very young child. The child didn't know what was happening. They were taken to the schools, and many of them, of course, we know now, were abused. It's a horrendous history, Canadian history, but now we have the 94 calls to action, and many of us are really moving to do something about this. I belong to a Truth and Reconciliation group with Indigenous people and white people. And it's, for me, an educational experience. And we form deep relationships with the other, with the Indigenous person. But this history is not a good history of Canada. We're going to be a long time trying to come to deal with it. But I just want to say I really admire the Pope, because at my age, I have, a pain in my body. And when I looked at him, I thought I couldn't do what he did. And he's just a couple of years younger. So I admire him for making the effort. What I didn't like was all the clergy in the front before the Indigenous people at the liturgies. To me, that needs to be looked at and rectified.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that context, Lillian. I would just say that what you talked about was the image of the clergy in front of the Indigenous there. Reminds me of a comment that I heard during the opening of the Synod here in Rome last October. And I'm sure everyone, most of you know what's happening with the global Synod process that was kicked off last October by Pope Francis. It's a 2-year consultative process aimed to encourage Catholics around the world to, have effectively a greater say and participation in the life of the church, and particularly the laity. And at the opening mass for the Synod, the lay representatives were in the back and the priests and the clergy were in front. And for a church in which liturgy conveys so much in terms of signs and symbols and significance, that image was not necessarily an image, of a synodal church. That was what one observer said in October, and it strikes me as something that's similar to what you're saying now. And I think that's something that it's a fine observation.
Thanks, Lillian. And just to say that Diane Prince, who's also from British Columbia, said in the chat box, she agrees it was the government scheme that was there to kill the Indian in the child. What else is there to know? There is no good about it. Residential schools should have never happened. So that's another Canadian point of view. So we have Catherine and
Robert,
who has a question? Yeah, or
actually, Robert is the one who's speaking just now.
Yeah, very good. Okay.
There is very, very much to regret in this. I just want to make 2 quick comments and then a question, a more personal question to Christopher. The 2 quick comments are killing the Indian in the child is a phrase that deserves to be said and castigated. But let's let's not be naive about this. The government of Canada, like imperial governments throughout the 19th and early into the middle of the 20th century, colonial powers weren't really interested in, customs and rituals and so forth. They were interested in land, control, resources, ownership, money. Killing the Indian and the child wasn't because somebody disliked the Indian and the child. It was because Canada, up until 1867 as part of the British Empire, and then proceeding on as an independent or more or less independent country from that point on until the true independence somewhat later, was part of that European mentality that Europeans understood what the world is all about, and European ways of conducting commerce and owning stuff and running stuff at a profit and so forth was the way to go. And having Indigenous people exercising vigorous ownership and control of their own chunks of territory just wasn't on. And I think the United States listeners on this broadcast, understand that from the kind of wars that happened within the United States over getting full control of land there. So that's what it was all about. So that intergenerationally there'd be a waning of any kind of resistance by Indigenous people to controlling the land, except for those Indigenous people who became nice middle-class business people, and there were a lot of those too. But they were the ones who decided that, okay, we'll go with the new scheme. But the ones who wanted to go with the old scheme, with the original scheme, boy, that wasn't going to be on at all. And doctrine of discovery was the old-fashioned way of saying it. You're not a full human unless you're Christian. Well, the new way of saying it, starting in the early 1800s, was the sudden discovery of racism, where the language wasn't particularly religious. It was just that non-white people were not fully human, period. My second point, the second comment is really, this is a pendulum. This is a pendulum situation. Right now is not the time where people who had a good experience in religious schools, be they Catholic or Anglican or Presbyterian or United Church or even secular schools, those voices aren't the important ones now, and they're not being heard now. But there were those instances as well. And when one scratches a bit, one finds them. But, with all of the crap on the other side, it's not the moment to say, yes, but, some people had a good time. Yeah, so what? It was still a systemic issue that those who were perpetrating abuse were not monitored, were not corrected, were not stopped from doing it. And so a good nun, a good priest or whatever who was in an institution where bad things were happening was part of a system that kind of accepted that. So it's a pendulum, and some years from now, there'll probably be more voices that say, you know what, on balance, here's the range of things that happened. And one of them came out very clearly on Monday in the CBC coverage, where after the Pope's first speech of apology in Iqaluit, two elderly men were being interviewed by the CBC interviewer. And one of them said how much he appreciated the apology because finally he could stop being a bad husband and a bad father, which came directly out of his experience. And instead, now that this had been fully acknowledged by the Pope, now he felt he had the strength to start improving. That was very, very, very significant, I thought. Anyway, this is a segue to my question to Christopher. Very few of us got to be on this trip. You were there. You were having personal engagements of various sorts. Encounter, as you implied, is key to the Pope, that he touched people, that he exchanged with them and so forth. You yourself, what were your highlights of personal experience that really meant something to you? Thanks for accepting this long ramble.
Of course, and thank you for sharing that history. I think a few things. I want to pick up with what you said about Iqaluit, because it answers your question in a bit, in some way, and it concurs with the sentiment that you heard expressed on the CBC. And it was when we were in Iqaluit waiting for the Pope to arrive. As I do when I cover these events, I just kind of roam and see, who will speak to me. And typically at a papal event, that's easy to do. But, one of the things that you're very mindful of on a trip like this is you're roaming through a crowd where people, many of them have suffered tremendous trauma because of the very nature of the event and what we're there to discuss. And so you have to, approach people very differently. And I was speaking with this woman who was, I forget exactly where she was from, but she had just flown in that morning with her father to Iqaluit. And she said to me, I don't need to hear the Pope's apology, she said, but I'm here with my father because he needs to hear it. He's a school survivor. And for so long he's been holding on to this, as a fresh start, and it was that sense that perhaps it could provide a fresh start. And it was hearing those sort of testimonials throughout the week that were my favorite and most memorable moments of the trip. Another very special moment for me was at the end of the Pope's prayer service in Edmonton. It was at the end of his first day. And he had gone to Sacred Heart Parish, which is not just the only Indigenous parish in Edmonton, but the only specifically Indigenous dedicated parish in all of Canada. And the Pope had just finished his first full day in Canada, and frankly, he looked very tired at that point. He had flown in, the day before. It had been 11 hours on the flight. And at the end, as he was leaving, he's being wheeled out in his wheelchair, and the Pope greeted a group of Indigenous that were also there in wheelchairs. And there was this sense of real solidarity and joy. And you saw this Pope who, again, seemed fatigued, come alive. And then, he comes out of the parish after having this encounter, and he spoke to all of them. And totally threw the security detail, into disarray, because he decided he wanted to go greet those that had gathered in the parking lot or on the street rather, and go up to the fence. And this was not planned for. And so first you had his bodyguards trying to figure out how to get his wheelchair over the sidewalk. And then they tried to figure out how to get him over to the people, and then how to get the car over to him. And it was absolute mayhem. And we were all there sort of gathered around, sort of being held back at a distance. But then all of a sudden he started coming directly to where we were because we had been kept to the side. And then all of a sudden that's where he wanted to go. So everyone was going everywhere, and it was pure chaos. And those are the moments that are really special. It's hard to capture that in print or even in photographs, but you kind of get a sense that, Pope Francis may be doing this, maybe he's been doing this for 10 years, but he's still going to find a way to do what he wants to do. And, if he decides he wants to go and have a conversation or be near someone, it doesn't matter what protocol is, he's going to do it. So those are the fun moments that really stand out to me as well. But Iqaluit was really special, I have to say, just being up there in such a remote area, hearing, there had been people that had, flown in from all over to be there, and to hear those testimonials in that location was really special.
Thank you, Chris. We have a question from Jane. Bishop Jane, maybe?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes. Christopher, I love what you just described in terms of the flexibility to sort of go off script, that to see some of those moments. I tried to watch as much of as I could on TV and to see some of that, although I think, again, it's very controlled, and so you miss a bit of that. One of the things that lingers for me, of course, is that the doctrine of discovery is really a statement of white supremacy from the beginning of it, and that is a problem that you can rescind the doctrine of discovery. You can say as the bishops will point out that it's not operative. It has no standing or anything like that. You can do that, but that doesn't change the attitude which underlies that. And those of us that have worked with truth and reconciliation, and even in the United States, from the George Foreman case, working with the issues of white supremacy, recognizing that we are, for me to own that I am part of a white supremacist culture is just a very, very big thing, because then that puts a lot of weight on me as someone who needs to own that and look at my attitudes and make changes in my life, and to work not just to change in the church as an institution, but also that I have a responsibility as a citizen of Canada to look at things like the Indian Act, for example, which continues to control and suppress and dominate, and for what? For our benefit, not really for them. And so what I come away with, when I come down to this, is, like, what is it that I can learn from this whole experience? And from what I learn, what is mine to do, and to take that ownership? So if this papal visit has any significance or meaning that's going to affect my life and my place in Canadian society, it's asking those hard questions of myself and coming up with some proactive answers. So I guess that's basically more commentary than it is question, but I'm grateful for the work that you do to bring this story to us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. I think you expressed a sentiment that I've heard a lot of in the lead up to the trip, during the trip, and after it, is for those that have begun the process of walking with and accompanying and listening to survivors, Indigenous survivors, the question for them is, to those that are listening to them is, how does this change your way of understanding or your way of being church? And I think that's something that, that still remains to be answered at every level in the Canadian church. And one of the examples I will point to that a number of Indigenous people that I spoke with in Canada pointed to back in here at the Vatican last March, but also during the visit, was Archbishop Don Bolin of Regina, who, when he's asked to go anywhere to speak, brings along, an elder and with him, alongside of him, because he understands it as, a journey that he is still having to listen and learn as well. And that was pointed to as sort of one way of putting this in action.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jane. I just would add that I think a formal rescinding of the document of the document or a doctrine of discovery is good in this sense, is that most Catholics don't even know it exists, don't even understand the Catholic Church's complicity in white supremacy. So I think in that way, it does help bring us toward a greater sense of what we need to be doing. So, so I'll go to the last question here. Joan, you have a question or a comment?
Joanne, you mean? Yes.
Yes, go ahead, Joanne.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make a comment further to something that was mentioned about the rows and rows of bishops and cardinals that were sitting ahead of the Indigenous people. There is, if you go to YouTube, and some of you may know about this, there is a priest who has recorded a song that he wrote, and he's singing it with his clerical collar on and strumming a guitar. And he wrote this song, Rows and Rows of Men. And I was, I wanted to dance to it actually, because I thought we need this. And Bishop Jane, my bishop, just spoke from the Catholic Network for Women's Equality. And, when I looked at that, I'm living right now up on Bruce, this is my second point. I'm up on the Bruce Peninsula on Georgian Bay, very close to 2 Indian reserves. And when you study the history of this beautiful peninsula, and you see what the white man did to confiscate the land from the Indigenous people up here, I am so embarrassed as a white person. And I always, it's just a travesty. There was no truth. We'll never have reconciliation till we have truth. But the white people like me really have to eat humble pie, and because the history is tough as to how we took over their lands. When they trusted us, they trusted the treaties. So it goes on and on and on, and I'm ashamed. But the white privilege, I try to look, Canada is so multicultural now. We need all these new immigrants to keep this vast country going. And I try to look at when I'm interacting with them, as I do regularly, because I live in Toronto too, and it's the most multicultural city in the world, is I always try to think first, you have white privilege. Now, go into compassion and most of all, humility. And I think a lot of that is needed. And a lot of you have spoken to really important things here today. But look up the song, Rows and Rows of Men. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just say there's a Pearl Gervas who seems to be trying to get a question, and I guess she was raising her hand physically. I didn't see it. Do you have a question, Pearl, quickly? Oh, okay. You'll have to unmute yourself, Pearl. Go for it.
Thank you.
Okay, sir.
Thank you. After an apology is made, and which was done by Pope Francis, there's always a question of what next and what can we do? And I really believe that one of the things that I have taken to be very important in my own conversion and my own action and follow-up of this trip is to take some of the words of Francis at the talk he gave in Quebec City, which I think should be read by every single person in the country. And some of the words that he used there that tie into the Synod is to start using or to continue using a pastoral imagination.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that very, very encouraging. And some of his last words were going from failure to hope. And somehow my own conversion is about where I, as in my memory as a Canadian, as a human being, that I have failed to recognize the other, failed to recognize the culture and how we can integrate it or how we can celebrate it in our own faith, to one of hope, where there really is that going away from power and abuse. I was fascinated by the statement of the words power and abuse. We have so much power left in the hierarchy, clericalism, And at that Quebec talk, Francis really highlighted that, and even used the finger to the clerks that were there, which I thought was quite significant as far as I was concerned.
Wow.
And so I just want to try to find new ways of, not that there aren't old ways to do it too, but to look at our imagination and to be very inclusive and excited and joyful about what we can do to really live out I am sorry, and to celebrate that.
Thank you. Thank you, Pearl.
Chris.
Chris, do you have any final comments before we take this off? Go ahead and end the meeting.
Sure. Well, I'll just say two things. One, I think Pearl actually offered a very fine benediction, failure to hope. I think that's a fitting way to end it. The only other thing I would say is that I mentioned earlier the statement put out by the Canadian bishops and sort of the summary of of their reflection and what they heard during the week. And the takeaways were a statement from the Vatican on rescinding the doctrine of discovery or some clarification on that. Greater transparency on the archives so that various survivors can get access to what happened in these schools. And that's both something that will require cooperation with Rome and local dioceses. And then the return of artifacts. The Vatican Museums is in possession of many artifacts that these communities feel belong to them and would like to see returned. And then the Canadian bishops have promised and pledged, I believe it's 30, it could be 40 million in remuneration. And to date, I think they've only raised 5 or 6. And so those are sort of the benchmarks that they've laid out. They meet at the end of September, I believe, perhaps October. We'll be discussing these things. So I would just say, I'm certainly following that. So stay tuned at National Catholic Reporter, and we'll keep our eyes on that and keep reading and keep following us. I know FutureChurch will keep its eyes on it as well. So thank you, Deb. Thank you, Russ. And thank you, everyone.